Thanks everybody for the opportunity to be here today. And Ann and I were talking about this agenda going back a little ways, and we thought, cohesive strategy 101, what does that look like? And since Ann's been involved since really the very beginning of designing and developing the cohesive strategy, we thought we could sort of tag team this. So I hope you're still in for that, Ann.
I definitely am, Kate.
All right, so I'll just briefly give my spiel that I typically give folks when they say, well, where did this come from? And in 2009, Congress passed the FLAME Act based on a decade of, well, the FLAME Act had a lot of information in it, had a lot of direction in it, but part of the direction was to ask the Departments of Agriculture and the Interior to develop this cohesive strategy to address some of the wildland fire issues that we have across the country. And even then, and going back into late 90s, early 2000s, people were dying. We were losing more and more habitat, more and more acreage. We were spending gobs and gobs and gobs of money. We were losing communities and economies. And so this group, as Ann mentioned, going back quite a ways, was concerned about all of those things that weren't getting any lesser, if that's the right way to say that. They weren't decreasing in intensity, they were increasing. And so they spent 5 years collaborating with a lot of different groups across the nation to pull together, hey, what are your biggest challenges? What are you seeing out there, everybody across the landscape? And when we say that, it's important to note that we're not just talking about the forested landscape, but we're also talking about rangelands. And sometimes that gets, I don't want to say forgotten, but the CNN moments are usually the great big forests on fire. And so rangelands don't maybe get the big press that they should, but are equally as dangerous and equally as devastating and cause the same level of problems that we see in some of the western forests around wildfire. So it's important to note that. And for 5 years, we collected information, we collected challenges and barriers and what were people trying to achieve. And what surfaced from those conversations were these 3 challenges that needed addressing. One being the resiliency of our landscapes needs to be improved. And how do we do that? And then of course, fire adaptation in our communities. And of grave concern at the time and continues to be is what can we do around safe and effective wildfire response? Like I said, people were dying, people continue to die, firefighters, members of the public. And what happened is those became the 3 overarching goals of the cohesive strategy. Those were the 3 biggies. And it was also really important to note that, let's see if I can flip the page here. It was also important to note that there's sound science at the basis for everything that folks were trying to do even back then, but now we've just validated that everything that we try to do, from the national to the regional to the very most local arenas, is really grounded in solid, sound, best available science. And so we had this little graphic made that describes for you, and I hope you can read it. It's a little small on my teeny tiny screen, but this graphic just kind of visually displays that here are these 3 overarching goals. We used to refer to them as 1, 2, and 3, but that sort of made folks wonder, well, is one more important than the other? And it's not. That's just the list that we have. And so it's very important for us to realize that all of these are intertwined. So if you're at the local level and you're working towards projects that are on your landscapes that might be adjacent to your communities, that might affect, of course, how firefighters can defend either homes or actually do work on the landscape, you can see pretty quickly how easily they're intertwined. And I hope that this graphic shows that. And I'm going to stop talking for a second just to see if there's anything Ann wants to add before I keep going.
No, I think, Katie, the only thing I would add is that, if you can read the little diagram on your screens, it really hits home when you read the bottom part of the resilient landscapes. It wasn't, the landscapes should be resilient to fire, but also insect and disease disturbances. Clear across the country, we're seeing the forest mortality or problems with, different types of diseases that are affecting, the vegetation, whatever it is. And even with the fires that we had last fall here in Oregon, because of the density of the smoke for numerous days, it changed what the trees, acted like. It was so out of the norm. And it really is going to be important for us to pay attention to changing science. And I know the U.S. Geological Service, they have a new fire strategy that they're, based on science that will be out. And I hope that folks are able to access this type of assessment data in their local areas. If not, we can certainly add some links and information to that in the chat later.
Well, I'm just going to say exactly, and I'll probably say that a lot throughout the day, because there are so many issues at play and so many things that are calling us all to the table. And that is really the beauty of the cohesive strategy, is what is valuable to you, where you live, where you work, in what you do. And the one thing that I hope we walk away with today is the notion that I see myself in the cohesive strategy in a variety of different ways, not just because it's my job, but where I am as an individual, where I live in Oregon, the groups that I participate in. And I hope that NACD and the individual conservation districts, and I love that number, that there's 3,000, almost one in every county. There are opportunities for conservation districts to engage around issues that are important in those areas that ultimately still make meaningful progress towards these goals. So if you're cool, Anne, I'm going to go ahead and bump a page here. And look at all those words. I apologize for that. So if your eyes blur a little bit, it's okay. But I think the one thing that I really wanted to point out today is that the Wildland Fire Leadership Council has been around since about 2002, and Mr. French, as the acting Deputy Undersecretary for Agriculture, Department of Ag, is sitting at this table and representing NRCS there. And as you can see by just the federal members that sit around this table, let me move all those pictures. You can see that there's quite a bit of knowledge, experience, a high level connection at this level. And while WFLC doesn't set policy, we call it that, Wildland Fire Leadership Council, or WFLC, spends a lot of time acting outside of their getting together. There's opportunities for each of the members to act in different circles and help foster and help people understand where we need to be prioritizing our investments, where we need to be looking at other tools in the toolbox to help some of those things along as we're trying to develop ways to better work together for better fire outcomes. And so I just wanted to list here for you the 19 members and where they come from. And you can read those, but I thought it was important to note that there's definitely some representation there at the NRCS level, but it also includes some science. It includes tribal influence, all 5 of the bureaus in the Department of Interior, including Office of Wildland Fire, which is not a separate bureau, U.S. Fire Administration. Whoops.
The Department of Defense was a good one, a recent addition, being that they're like the 7th largest land manager in the country. And they have their own invasive species programs, all sorts of different programs. So it was really important to broaden the original membership of the Wildland Fire Leadership Council to be more inclusive of the agencies that are managing those lands. And they are a lot of conservation districts have great relationships with the management of the installations and such across the country. I think it makes sense that there's another connection there with districts.
That's right, Ann. When you were mentioning who else, that was one of the actions that WFLIC took a few years ago to really bring DoD into the membership, because that was a huge part that was missing in terms of leadership. So that's been an interesting add-on to WFLIC. They have since, and are working on right now, a cohesive strategy for DoD around their lands. Like you said, there's so many. There's such an influence there landscape-wise.
And Katie, I just got a message from Tom Harper, who said he had to pop off, but intended to be back, and wanted me to mention the renewed interest that Department of Defense has in engaging the WFLIC and developing a cohesive strategy for DoD lands, but one which fits with the national cohesive strategy.
Without a doubt.
Thank you, Tom Harper. I appreciate that message, and we'll see you back on here later.
Yeah. So just a quick list of the non-federal members, and you can read those. And then interestingly, when we take a step down a little closer to the ground, there's 3 regions of the Wildland Fire Leadership Council. And initially, I don't want to cut you short on time to read this, but initially our first task was, how can we facilitate implementation of the cohesive strategy? And so we've spent the last better part of a decade working on how do we help people understand what the cohesive strategy is and what does it mean at their level or in their space? Because we do know that the cohesive strategy was created to not be this top-down pressure of here's how we want you to do things, but more of an acknowledgement that from the ground up, this is where things are going to change. And leadership can help at that level to facilitate some of that change. But for the most part, it's not a directive, but more of a, how can we, I'm going to use this a lot, how can we work better together to achieve better fire outcomes? When people say, what's the cohesive strategy? I usually lead with that because that's the simple way. But as you saw just in that graphic, there's a whole lot more to it, and it is very, very intertwined, of course, and rooted in sound science. And you wanted me to mention a little bit about what some of the priorities are. And a couple of these I hope resonate with conservation districts, in particular, anything having to do with resilient landscapes, I think will be important. And that doesn't always mean just federal or state lands. An equal partner in those efforts is private landowners. So I think there's really opportunity there for conservation districts to engage. Of course, reducing risk to communities. Lately, smoke management and the smoke issues around prescribed fire have surfaced. And so that's coming to the foreground now for WFLIC attention. It's not on this list. It's not an official priority for WFLIC, but I think we'll see that emerge here in this next round. You guys mentioned what happens after a fire, what happens after a disaster. And I know Ann's going to talk about that a little bit, but there's opportunity there for us to look at how can we mitigate some of those impacts beforehand. And so how can we use the same collaborative process to look at not just the fire, regardless of where that is or what type of landscape, but what could we be doing pre-fire, during fire, and after fire that can help build those resilient landscapes for the future. We know that fire is going to be an issue in some of our ecosystems, especially in the West. And even though human-caused fires are a great big issue in most places, sometimes there's always, in the West anyway, lightning is a big issue too. And sometimes that's an even split between natural caused fire and human caused fire, depends on where you are. But those give us opportunities to understand that fire will always be a part of what we do. And we can always address those needs around natural fires as well as human caused fires just as equally. I hope that makes sense. I'm kind of floundering there, but I'm trying to make that point. But it comes across in terms of mitigating post-fire impacts. And so in the West, we've been working on that closely with the Western Governors Association, along with the representatives from both private and public agencies.
I'll chime in there, Katie, if that's okay.
Please.
So one of the things that you mentioned, you know, human caused ignitions, one of the things over the last several years, you know, that I've noticed, I have had friends that work on prevention teams that used to go across the country and help out, and they really aren't so much called on anymore. And I think that there's somewhat of a complacency that we have so many fires and they are getting larger that, you know, we just keep throwing money at suppression. And like Chris said early on, you know, we're not getting ahead of this with restoration. We can't keep up. So where I look at this, it's like we do need to have a focus on prevention. And I've seen in my own Clackamas County in Oregon here, and you'll hear about that later in panel 3, where they've done a lot of Firewise or prevention efforts to try to reduce the number of fires. So I think even in those little steps and things that the districts do locally on where we can have, you know, a role, I think is really important. And I think you nailed it, Katie, with talking about how, you know, post-fire is really when people think about conservation districts and their connection with EQIP or funds with NRCS. But they don't think about engaging conservation districts early in the preparedness or planning stages of it. And I hope that changes. I hope that this summit helps to change that.
I think those are good statements. I'm not watching the chat, Anne, so if there's something that comes in there that we need to address, just jump in. The one thing that when I was talking about what I was getting at a minute ago was how do we live with wildland fire? And that's the very core of the vision for the cohesive strategy, which is to safely and effectively put fires out when we need to, use fire when we can, right place, right time, all of that, and make sure that we're managing our natural resources based on sound science. And this is just off the cuff. It's a little more tight than this, but then the last statement is, as a nation, live with wildland fire. So if we can't get rid of fire, which we know we can't, then how do we live with fire? How do we learn to live with wildland fire? And that looks different everywhere, no matter where you are. It's a little bit different in the Midwest, in the Southeast, Northeast, of course, and you guys are going to learn more about that with the other summits. But I threw up a map here to give you some idea of the regions that WFLIC has originally put in place around the cohesive strategy, but now we find ourselves working more on those priorities that we talked about a minute ago, because we've done, well, like I said, about a decade of helping people understand what the cohesive strategy is and what it looks like at their level. And now we act more as facilitators of how can we help you individually, or you, a group of people or an organization, really embrace the cohesive strategy and put it to work for you where you are facing the wildfire challenges, the wildland fire challenges that you have. So this is just a quick map. As you can see by the light teal color, that's our region in the West. We've got everything from Alaska to Nebraska, including the islands, the Pacific Islands. And then you can see the other two regions, Southeast and kind of the Northeast, Midwest area. Anything you want to add to that, Anne?
I think that's good. I'm glad that you showed the map on that, because they are definitely different districts and different regions, and it gets very confusing. And when that FEMA also has different regions,
it's fun.
You know, it makes, you know, when you're looking at disaster, you know, preparedness and recovery, finding funds to pay for these projects and pay for what we're asking, you know, for districts to engage in, you know, matters, and what district you're in, and there'll be more information about that later on today. But I'm also working on drafting a desk guide for conservation districts to help with understanding and implementing cohesive strategy that'll have these maps of the different regions and different agencies. So
you bet. What I liked in my homework around conservation districts is that there's one key focus, but everybody is focusing on what matters to them in their place. Resource conservation district, soil and water conservation district, and I think as you hear from the different folks in the different summits, you'll see how well they play together and where some of the gaps still are, and how everybody can better engage and, again, work better together. I use that a lot.
That sounds good. And I've got 2 questions in the chat already. So
okay, go ahead.
7 minutes left.
If you could read them, that'd be great. I don't have them up on my screen.
No problem. Kate, are you aware of the joint WIFLC National Invasive Species Council initiative to explore more effective co-management of fire and invasive species, mainly annual grasses? If so, do you have any update on that and its potential relevance to this group? Thank you, Jeff Morissette, for that question.
Thank you. Yes, I am aware of it. And the executive director for WIFLC is very engaged with that opportunity around co-management of risk. And it's one of the key principles of the cohesive strategy is how do we, and can we find better ways to not just contribute and collectively invest, but how can we collectively and as partners co-manage risk and co-manage some of these collective investments, I guess is how I'm going to say that. And that is one really good example of that. But I don't have an update on that for you today, but I certainly could get one. And maybe before the end of the day, I could provide that for you before we're done here today. I will talk to Mike Zupko, and his contact information will be here at the end. So I'll make sure you get that.
That sounds good. The second question from Lori Tippin is, where does home hardening fit into the cohesive strategy, and what level of focus or priority does home hardening receive?
Huge. To be frank, the goal of fire adapted communities embraces a lot of different types of work, one of which is at the homeowner scale, and looks at ways within National Fire Protection Association, their Firewise program, which focuses now even more so on home hardening. Those are ways that individuals can participate in helping to advance those goals, and how those are ways for neighborhood groups and local organizations to convene around those particular issues at a very, very small scale by comparison to a 1,000,000-acre landscape. But it really does, when we talk about the cohesive strategy and we say, not only can we not do it alone anymore, no one organization or agency can do it alone, likewise, or conversely, it's going to take everybody. So there are places for everyone to engage around the goals of the cohesive strategy, and that's one of those ways. Home hardening, any sort of preparedness at the neighborhood or very local individual level. Evacuation planning is really surfacing as another high priority for education and prevention. As Ann mentioned, if you're ready and set, what are you waiting for? Because we know we're going to deal with fire. We know that resources, which has emerged as an even a bigger issue than it was 10, 15 years ago when this was being developed, resources, if fire is a year-round problem now, that means getting the resources that we need to address those fires are also a bigger issue. And so, like, come August, come July, August, September, when everybody's been fighting fire since April and everybody's still out on fires, the question of evacuation comes up around, well, do I wait for someone to tell me to go, or do I just go? And the answer is, you got to just go. So those are the types of education things that we're seeing surface. And home hardening, of course, with the onset of more fires that are getting into WUI fires, wildland urban interface fires, that are actually really just mowing down communities, and there's no opportunity for defending a home. And fire departments in those type of fires are engaged in an evacuation effort. When there's a point where things change and suddenly law enforcement is needing help getting people out. And so with life safety being the #1 priority for pretty much any fire agency on the planet, the priority switches to how do we get people out, how do we save people, as opposed to how do we protect your home, which falls right behind it in the priority list. But there's a breaking point there when fires are in a community that's, you know, a fast wind driven fire that you can't get ahead of. Evacuation is now surfacing as one of those issues, a little more so. But to get back to your question, yes, home hardening is a part of that picture and fits squarely within that fire adapted communities effort.
Sounds good, Katie. I really appreciate what you say to that. And, you know, in helping folks understand evacuation, you know, I watched several times where people sit on their porch and they'll wait for a fire truck or a sheriff's deputy to come by to tell them it's time to go. When they're overwhelmed, they're not going to show up. And in the original call to action that we did back in 2008, 2009, when we were first trying to pull together this concept of a cohesive strategy where everybody would come together, it said right on it that we are at a point in this country where we as fire service are not going to be able to help everybody. And so you have a personal responsibility to harden your home or to do defensible space. Be cognizant of cleaning out your gutters. If you're in a rental and you don't have, you know, the responsibility or authority to do those things, you have to take steps to try to work with your land, you know, the manager and fix that. With that, we have just a minute so left, and there was one more slide you had that I really wanted to try to, you know, how can districts really engage with cohesive strategy? And that's it. The Firewise, the Joint Chiefs.
Yep.
Thank you for putting that up.
We've touched on a lot of those today, and I think everybody who has spoke before me has even talked about some of these. So these are just a few of the ways. And what I really like best about conservation districts is, like I said before, they really reflect the place-based issues that are going on in that district. And so the more local you can engage, I think the better. The more understanding, the more that those local cultures start to shift to things. That's a really great example, to things of, you know, we've been sort of placated over the years to think that there's a fire truck that's going to come when something happens. And the hard truth of that is there are instances, and more instances lately, where that can't happen. So we as fire professionals and education professionals need to start shifting that culture of understanding in our communities. That's just one example, of course, but there's a lot of different ways for folks to engage. And here's a short list. And as always, you know, my job is to help connect some of those dots so we can continue to have this conversation, if you like. And I'm just going to leave this there.
That sounds good. And we have some great comments in the chat. And if you
to me, especially if they say good things, tell me.
well, they do. And unfortunately, though, we are out of time and we need to turn it over to panel 1 and to our showcase host, Wyoming. But I definitely want to say thank you to you, Katie. Great presentation. Thanks for letting me tag team it with you. I know that we've gone through a lot of this and the plan development and the comments in there in the chat. I definitely take a minute and try to respond to those if you can. Ellen, I really appreciate your comment in here about land use and American Planning Association. That's spot on with FEMA's building science program and such. And the same with Doug Rushton. And you know, you're exactly right. Communications, poor broadband or when the cells are down because the power's out or such, I saw it. People got their information from Facebook on their phone, not an emergency management system, or website. But and Sarah, thank you too for your comments, and Danielle. There's a bunch of links with great information in there. Please, please, please access those and follow up with them.